If you still believe that you are this body, then you are still asleep inside the greatest illusion ever created. The ego calls this life, the soul calls it forgetting. Your true identity is not this body, not your mind, not your story, and the discomfort you feel when hearing this is the ego struggling to keep alive the false identity that sustains the illusion. According to authentic Hermeticism associated with Thoth and preserved in the Corpus Hermeticum, the central error of the human being is to confuse the O-ball shell with the essence, the instrument with that which observes through it. The physical is only a temporary vehicle within the matrix of form, time, and matter. The soul precedes it, is not born here, and does not die here. True awakening does not happen when you learn something new, but when you remember who you are beyond the veil of Maya, beyond the spiritual blindness that made you believe that you are the name, the body, and the thought. While the ego governs, you live fragmented, separated from the source, repeating cycles. When the soul's identity begins to emerge, this sensation of not belonging arises, of a forgotten mission, of a hidden truth. This video confronts exactly that. The false identity collapses, the illusion cracks, and what remains is the essence that has always been silently observing everything, waiting for the moment to be remembered. You feel, in the middle of the most ordinary day, that something in you does not fit inside this body, as if you were wearing clothing too tight for what you truly are. And this sensation is not imagination. It is the memory of the soul pressing against the ego. Physical identity is a temporary function, a role, a vehicle, and Hermeticism has always made it clear that the greatest deception of humanity is to confuse itself with form. When Thoth is associated with ancient wisdom, the central point is not superficial mysticism. It is the remembrance that consciousness precedes matter, and that which observes the body cannot be the body. The physical is born, ages and dissolves. The essence remains as a living principle. The ego hates this idea because it depends on form to exist. That is why resistance, fear, and confusion arise when you approach this truth. Your true identity is not in the mirror, it is in the silent observer behind it. From early on you were trained to say I while pointing to the body, to the name, to the story, and thus the false identity was reinforced until it seemed natural. This conditioning is the veil of illusion operating on psychological and spiritual levels at the same time. Gnosis describes this as forgetting, not ignorance. You did not lose something, you were distracted from yourself. Thoth, as a symbol of cosmic intelligence, points precisely to this error. Humanity looks outward believing it will find its origin there, but everything external belongs to the world of change. Your true identity is beyond the physical because it does not change with time. That is why you feel you have always been the same, even through so many different phases. This continuity does not belong to the body. When you identify with the physical, you fragment yourself because the body lives under laws of decay, comparison, and fear. The soul, by contrast, does not compete, does not age, and is not measured. Real awakening begins when this difference ceases to be merely understood and becomes felt. It is not a beautiful concept, it is an internal shock. The ego realizes it is not the center, only a survival mechanism. In Hermetic texts, liberation does not come from accumulating beliefs, but from dissolving the false identity that sustains the prison. The matrix is not only social, it is internal. As long as you say, I am this, you limit yourself. True identity does not fit into labels, it observes them all. There is a specific moment when this truth begins to disturb more than it comforts, and that moment is a sign that the soul is trying to take command. You begin to perceive that nothing external fulfills, that no achievement resolves, that no explanation satisfies. This is not personal failure, it is ontological incompatibility. You are trying to feed something infinite with finite things. Thoth never pointed to salvation as something external. Hermeticism has always insisted that liberation comes from recognizing the inner principle. The false identity rests on fear of death. The true identity does not fear, because it did not begin here. That is why, deep down, you know you are not this body. The problem is that the ego speaks louder, until now. Spiritual blindness is not lack of sight, it is excess of identification. You see form too much and forget the background. The veil of Maya works by making the transient appear absolute. When you begin to question this, the world seems strange, almost artificial. This sensation is common in those touching the edge of truth. Gnosis calls this the breaking of enchantment. The enchantment is believing that experience is being. Thoth, as an archetype of the illuminated mind, points to the difference between what is used and what is. The body is used, the mind is used, true identity is what uses them. And this changes everything because you stop fighting to save yourself as form and begin to remember yourself as essence. Your personal story was built upon a false foundation. The idea of separation from God, from origin, from totality. This idea sustains the ego and keeps the illusion active. When Hermeticism speaks of unity, it is not speaking of emotional union, but of nature. The soul does not reconnect to the source. It never left it. What left was attention. That is why awakening is remembrance, not conquest. Your true identity beyond the physical does not need to be created, only recognized. And this recognition hurts at first because it dismantles everything you used to define yourself. The ego calls this a crisis. The soul calls it a return. And Thoth points to this as the moment when the human being begins to truly know itself. You realize that the deepest suffering does not come from events, but from identification with the one who suffers. When something happens, the body reacts, the mind interprets, but something in you remains intact. That something is the key. It does not react, it observes, it does not despair, it witnesses. It is not born with the problem, nor does it die with it. This is not emotional numbness, it is ontological lucidity. Hermeticism does not teach escape from the world, it teaches correct position within it. When you occupy the position of essence, the world changes function. It ceases to be a prison and becomes a field of experience. The false identity seeks control, the true identity operates through understanding. That is the difference between living asleep and living awake. The matrix remains active as long as you believe you are small, limited, and separate. That is why it constantly reinforces physical identity, documents, numbers, images, comparisons. All of this feeds the ego. Real awakening begins when you see this game happening inside you. Thoth, as a principle of order and intelligence, represents this capacity to see the mechanism without being swallowed by it. When you see, you detach. When you detach, you remember. The lost spiritual identity begins to reorganize, not as a special character, but as lucid consciousness. This breaks the fantasy of being someone to reveal the truth of being, and this transition is the most delicate point on the path. Many confuse this perception with spiritual arrogance, but it is the opposite. The ego wants to be special, the soul wants to be true. The true identity beyond the physical does not need to prove anything, because it does not depend on external recognition. It recognizes itself. Hermeticism has always warned against the trap of spiritual pride, which is merely the ego using elevated concepts to survive. That is why the language is direct, almost cutting. Thoth does not flatter, he reveals. And the revelation is simple. While you identify with the transient, you suffer. When you identify with the principle, you watch suffering pass. This does not eliminate the human experience, it places it in its proper position, and that position is secondary. There is a deep fear when this truth begins to emerge, the fear of disappearing. This fear does not belong to the soul, it belongs to the ego. The ego knows it does not cross the threshold. The true identity does not fear because it never depended on form. This is the point that separates spiritual curiosity from real awakening. Curiosity seeks comfort. Awakening demands loss of false identity, loss of narratives, loss of the need to be defined. Thoth, in the Hermetic sense, represents this threshold. He does not offer promises of happiness, he offers lucidity. And lucidity is liberating, but first it is devastating to what is false. That is why few cross. You begin to notice that your thoughts are not you. They arise, change, contradict themselves. Something in you remains stable while everything oscillates. That something is not trained, not constructed, not learned. It is remembered. Gnosis calls this the conscious spark. Hermeticism points to it as the principle that knows itself. When you touch this point, life takes on a different texture. Less drama, more clarity, less fear, more presence. Identity beyond the physical does not remove you from the world. It returns you to it without illusions. And this changes how you act, choose, and position yourself, not by morality, but by alignment. The false identity lives by comparison. Better, worse, above, below. The true identity lives by perception. It is not measured, it is recognized. That is why awakening is not spectacle, it is inner silence. The noise diminishes, the urgency diminishes, the need to prove diminishes. This is not apathy, it is precision. Thoth, as a symbol of true knowledge, always points to the order that emerges when internal confusion dissolves. The soul remembers it is not lost, only distracted. And this remembrance reorganizes everything. The internal chaos was the effect of mistaken identification. When that falls away, clarity appears effortlessly. This is the sign that something real is happening. You can spend years seeking techniques, systems, external initiations, and still remain trapped if you do not touch this central point. Hermeticism was never about accumulating rituals, but about correcting perception, seeing the false as false, the real as real. Identity beyond the physical is not mystical, it is ontological. It is about what you are, not what you do. When this begins to reveal itself, life does not become perfect, but it becomes true. And that is infinitely more powerful. The ego wants results, the soul wants alignment. Thoth points to this alignment as the true gold. Everything else is distraction. There comes a moment when you realize that the question is not who do I want to be, but who am I before wanting. This inversion changes everything. The false identity lives projecting the future, the true identity dwells in the now without effort. Real awakening does not take you away, it brings you back not to the body but to the point that has always been present. This point does not speak loudly, does not impose itself, does not sell itself, it observes. And the more you recognize this observer, the less power the illusion has. The matrix depends on unconsciousness. Consciousness dissolves the game. Thoth, in this sense, is not a character, it is a living principle. You begin to realize that the existential pain that accompanied you for so long was a call, not a mistake. A call to leave identification with the small self and remember the identity of the soul. This call manifests as restlessness, as a sense of not belonging, as relentless seeking. When you understand this, the search changes direction. Inward, behind the mind, beyond the physical. Gnosis has always affirmed that the sleeping human lives as if dead. Awakening is to wake up while still here, and to wake up is to remember who wakes. This is the point this video touches, directly, without anesthesia. The resistance that arises now is expected. The ego senses threat, it tries to rationalize, discredit, divert. Observe this. This internal movement is living proof that something true is being touched. If it were mere fantasy, there would be no reaction. Truth confronts because it dismantles structures. Thoth, as a Hermetic reference, represents this function, separating the real from the illusory, not by belief but by direct perception. Once you begin to see, you cannot unsee, and there is no turning back. Identity beyond the physical begins to take space, not as an idea but as living presence, and this shifts the axis of your existence. From this point on, the question ceases to be how to live better and becomes how to live from what I am. This shift is true awakening. Everything else is preparation. The ego wants quick answers, the soul wants deep alignment. Hermeticism has always worked at this level. That is why it is uncomfortable, direct, demanding. It offers no shortcuts, only clarity. And clarity demands responsibility. When you remember who you are, you can no longer live as if you did not know. This is not a burden, it is freedom, but a freedom that requires constant presence. And this presence begins now, exactly where you are reading this. If you are not this body, then who are you when the body falls silent? If you are not your thoughts, who is observing their flow right now? And if this consciousness has always been here, what exactly in you still resists remembering completely? You feel that something in you was never truly confined to this body, and this sensation returns in moments of silence, when the mask drops for a few seconds and the ego loses strength. This is not imagination. It is the memory of the soul trying to pierce the veil of illusion. Hermeticism has always affirmed that the body is an instrument, and that the fatal error of humanity is to confuse the vehicle with the driver. When Thoth is invoked as an authority of knowledge, it is not to create fantasy, but to point to a law. That which observes cannot be that which is observed. The physical is seen, felt, perceived. Therefore, it is not you. True identity lies beyond matter because it does not depend on matter to exist, and this changes everything. The false identity is strengthened when you believe that you were born here and that you end here. This belief is the core of the internal matrix. Gnosis calls this deliberate forgetting, not ignorance. You were led to identify with the transient in order to remain controllable. While you see yourself as a body, you live in fear. Fear of loss, fear of ending, fear of not being enough. The soul does not live in this register. Essence does not compete, does not rush, does not prove itself. Thoth, in the preserved Hermetic principles, points to awakening as recognition of conscious origin, not as adherence to a system. Identity beyond the physical is not built. It is remembered. And the ego knows this, which is why it resists. Observe how your mind tries to grasp this idea and turn it into a beautiful concept. That is the trick. The ego tries to survive by intellectualizing truth. But truth does not want to be thought, it wants to be seen. When you truly perceive that you are not this body, something inside relaxes and at the same time trembles. It relaxes because the pressure diminishes. It trembles because the false identity begins to crack. Hermeticism never promised comfort to the ego, it promised lucidity to the soul. Thoth symbolizes this cutting lucidity which separates the real from the illusory without anesthesia, and this cut is necessary. Physical identity lives in time, past, future, guilt, expectation. True identity lives outside this psychological prison. It is present before thought arises. When you feel that instant of pure presence without narrative, without name, without effort, that is it. The problem is that you were trained to flee from this state and return to the mind. The matrix depends on this constant return to inner noise. Spiritual blindness is not the absence of light. It is excess of distraction. Thoth points to silence as the key. Not as a technique, but as the natural condition of essence. Real awakening happens when you stop confusing yourself with the noise. You notice that the body changes, the personality changes, beliefs change, yet something in you has remained identical forever. This something has no age, it neither matures nor grows old. It simply observes. Gnosis calls this the conscious principle. Hermeticism affirms that this principle is the root of being. While you identify with what changes, you live unstable. When you identify with what observes, you find firmness without rigidity. Thoth did not teach denial of the body, but placing it in its proper position. The body is the stage, not the protagonist. True identity is not on the stage, it is in the observer. The false identity needs external validation. It needs to be seen, recognized, confirmed. The true identity asks for nothing. It is. That is why, when you begin to remember who you are beyond the physical, certain ambitions lose force, certain fears lose meaning, not because you became better, but because you stopped confusing yourself with the small self. The ego calls this loss of motivation. The soul calls it alignment. Hermeticism has always warned, when perception changes, life reorganizes itself. Thoth represents this natural order that emerges when illusion falls. It is not effort, it is consequence. There comes a point where you realize that the deepest pain does not come from events, but from identification with the character who suffers. Something in you has always remained intact, even in the worst moments. That something was not wounded, not broken, not corrupted. It simply observed. Identity beyond the physical is this silent witness. Gnosis affirms that salvation is not escaping the world, but awakening within it. Thoth points to this awakening as a return to conscious origin. It is not escape, it is lucidity. Not denial of life, but understanding of its nature. The matrix functions as long as you believe you are small, separate, and lacking. This belief sustains internal control. When you begin to remember your essence, this internal structure starts to collapse. The ego tries to react by creating spiritual fear, doubt, confusion. Observe this. This movement is proof that something real is being touched. If it were mere theory, there would be no resistance. Truth provokes because it threatens false identity. Thoth, as a Hermetic principle, does not console the ego, it confronts illusion. And this confrontation is the beginning of real awakening. You begin to notice that thoughts arise on their own, emotions arise on their own, sensations arise on their own, and something in you observes all of this happening. This observer does not choose, does not react, does not agitate, it simply is. This is the central point of applied Hermeticism. It is not mysticism, it is direct perception. True identity is not in the content of experience, but in the consciousness that witnesses it. Thoth points to this clearly. To know yourself is to know that which knows. Everything else is secondary. This inversion shifts the axis of existence. The false identity lives trying to improve itself. The true identity does not need improvement, it needs recognition. When you perceive this, the spiritual search changes completely. You stop chasing states and begin to observe what has always been present. Gnosis calls this remembrance. Hermeticism calls it return to the principle. Thoth represents this return as restored order. It is not adding something new, it is removing what is false. The ego feels this as symbolic death. The soul feels it as profound relief. And this relief does not come from outside. There is a subtle fear when this truth approaches, the fear of disappearing as a person. This fear is legitimate from the ego's point of view because it truly does not cross the threshold. Identity beyond the physical does not include the character, it includes the consciousness that uses it. Real awakening requires this surrender. It is not negotiation, it is yielding. Thoth, in the Hermetic sense, points to this moment as an inevitable passage. There is no awakening without loss of false identity. And this loss is not tragic, it is liberating. But the ego does not understand this. It only knows how to resist. You begin to realize that you do not need to prove anything in order to exist. This realization dismantles decades of conditioning. The internal matrix is sustained by the idea of insufficiency. The soul does not operate in this register. It does not seek value, it is value. When you touch this truth, certain relationships change, certain choices reorganize, not by morality but by inner coherence. Hermeticism has always worked with coherence between essence and manifestation. Thoth represents this coherence as natural law. When you align with what is not falls away on its own, without effort, without struggle. Physical identity lives on stories, who I was, what was done to me, what I should have been. True identity does not live on narrative. It is there before the story begins. When you perceive this, the past loses its power, not because you denied it, but because you stopped defining yourself by it. Gnosis calls this liberation from psychological time. Thoth points to the now as the access point to essence, not the now as a concept, but as living presence. It is in this space that identity beyond the physical reveals itself without words. You realize that the feeling of being different was always connected to this. It was not superiority, it was incompatibility. Your soul does not fully fit into an identity based only on form. This sensation was interpreted as a problem, but it is a sign that true identity was never completely forgotten. Hermeticism never promised that all would awaken, only that those who remembered would see. Thoth symbolizes this clear seeing without fantasy. And this seeing begins when you stop confusing yourself with what passes. The false identity lives in constant effort to maintain itself. The true identity requires no maintenance. It is stable by nature. When you touch this point, life becomes internally simpler, even if externally it remains complex. This simplicity is not superficial, it is essential. Gnosis affirms that excessive complexity is a sign of distance from the principle. Thoth points to simplicity as the result of real knowledge, not accumulated knowledge, but lived knowledge, and this knowledge is you remembering who you are beyond the physical. You begin to notice that suffering diminishes not because life changed, but because the point of identification changed. This is decisive. The world remains the world, but you are no longer bound to it in the same way. Hermeticism never promised a better world. It promised an awakened human being. Thoth represents this internal transformation that changes the relationship with everything. It is not escape, it is inner sovereignty. Identity beyond the physical is not captured by circumstances. It passes through experiences without losing itself in them. And this is real freedom. The internal matrix begins to fail when you see its mechanisms in action. Fear, guilt, the need for control. All of this belongs to the false identity. When you observe these movements without confusing yourself with them, something dissolves. Gnosis calls this the death of the psychological ego. Hermeticism describes it as inner transmutation. Thoth represents this process as the alchemy of consciousness. Not empty metaphor, but real change of state. You do not become another person. You stop being what you never were. You begin to feel that the question is no longer what should I do, but from where am I acting? This shift is profound. Action arising from false identity generates where. Action arising from essence generates clarity. Hermeticism has always placed the origin of action at the center. Thoth points out that acting without knowing oneself is acting blindly. To know oneself is to align origin and manifestation. When this happens, life flows with less internal friction, not because everything works out, but because you are no longer divided. Division was the real pain. Identity beyond the physical does not need to be defended because it cannot be attacked. It does not depend on circumstances. When you begin to live from this point, external life loses the power to define your value. This does not make you indifferent, it makes you lucid. Gnosis affirms that the awakened human participates in the world without losing themselves in it. Thoth represents this conscious participation, not isolation, not denial, but clear presence. And this presence begins when you stop confusing yourself with the body. The final resistance often appears as spiritual doubt. What if this is illusion? Observe that too. Doubt does not come from essence. It comes from the ego trying to regain control. Essence does not doubt, it recognizes. Hermeticism never asks for blind faith, it asks for direct perception. Thoth points to inner experience as the criterion, not belief. When you see, you do not need to believe. And what is being seen now is the difference between what you use and what you are. This difference changes everything. From here, remembrance tends to deepen, not linearly, but in waves. Each time you identify with the observer, illusion loses strength. Each time you fall back into false identity, pain returns. This is not punishment, it is feedback. Gnosis has always worked with this inner feedback. Thoth represents the intelligence that reads these signals. Real awakening is not a single event, it is stabilization of remembrance. And this stabilization begins with a simple and devastating question. If you are not this body, who are you when the body falls silent? If you are not your mind, who is observing your thoughts right now? And if this consciousness has always been here, what exactly still prevents you from fully remembering who you are beyond the physical? There is a moment when you realize you are living as if reduced, compressed inside something that was never large enough to contain what you truly are. This constriction is not psychological, it is ontological. It is the soul pressing against the false identity built upon the body. Hermeticism has always been direct. That which is eternal cannot be confined by form. When you identify with the physical, you accept a prison that was never meant for your essence. Thoth, as a principle of Hermetic wisdom, points to this without softening it. The human being sleeps because they believe they are what they see. And while they believe this, they live in spiritual blindness. True identity has never been in the body is merely the point of contact. You do not feel this restlessness by chance. It arises when the identity of the soul begins to remember itself. The ego interprets this as crisis, emptiness, or confusion. The soul recognizes it as a call. The veil of Maya works precisely in this way, making you believe the discomfort comes from outside when it comes from forgetting who you are. The matrix is not only social, it is internal, sustained by constant identification with form. Thoth never taught escape from the world, he taught correction of perception. True identity beyond the physical does not want to escape life, it wants to inhabit it from essence. Until that happens, everything feels displaced. Nothing fully fits. Notice how you have always known you were not merely this body. That silent certainty never left. It was only drowned out by noise, by narratives, by survival. Gnosis affirms that the greatest human trauma is forgetting one's origin. Not an intellectual forgetting, but an existential one. You did not forget a concept, you forgot yourself. Thoth represents this point of remembrance, where consciousness begins to recognize its own nature again. When this starts, the ego panics, because it lives off the confusion between being and seeming. The false identity must be believed. The true identity simply is. Physical identity lives under constant threat because it knows it is temporary. Hence fear, comparison, the need for control. The identity of the soul does not live in this state because it does not depend on time. It was not born here and does not end here. This recognition radically changes your relationship with life. Suffering loses its absolute weight. It does not disappear, but it no longer defines who you are. Hermeticism has always taught that suffering arises from mistaken identification. Thoth points to this as law, not opinion. While you confuse yourself with the body, you suffer as a body. When you recognize yourself as essence, you witness the body suffering without being lost in it. You notice the mind trying to capture this truth and turn it into elegant discourse. This too is the ego trying to survive. It prefers to talk about awakening rather than disappear into it. But real awakening is not comfortable for the ego. It requires silence, surrender, and loss of control. Thoth did not offer comforting answers. He offered rupture of illusion. And the primary illusion is believing that you are this collection of thoughts, memories, and sensations. All of that passes. Something in you remains. That something does not demand attention, but when it is recognized, everything changes. True identity does not shout, it waits. Spiritual blindness is collective because identification with the physical is taught from the beginning. You learn your name before you learn to observe. You learn your story before you perceive the observer of the story. This conditioning creates an artificial identity that appears solid but is fragile. Silence is enough to make it tremble. Presence is enough to crack it. Hermeticism has always been a path of deconditioning, not accumulation. Thoth represents this process of removing the false. Each layer that falls brings you closer to essence. And each layer that falls provokes fear in the ego. This fear is not a sign of error. It is a sign of accuracy. There is something in you that was never touched by anything that happened. Neither traumas, nor losses, nor failures. That something was present in every moment, observing. Identity beyond the physical is this untouched point. Gnosis calls it the divine spark, not in a superficial religious sense, but as a conscious principle. Thoth points to this principle as the true I, not the psychological self, but the essential self. When you touch this point, you realize that much of what you called life was merely reaction to stimuli, fears, expectations. Essence does not react, it understands. The false identity lives, trying to save itself. The true identity does not need salvation. This difference is brutal. When you begin to perceive it, many searches lose their meaning. Not because you gave up, but because you recognized you were searching in the wrong place. Real awakening does not give you something new, it returns something ancient, something that was always present but forgotten. Hermeticism has always been a path of remembrance. Thoth symbolizes this primordial memory that returns when the noise subsides. It is not a spectacular mystical event, it is a deep, silent internal displacement. You begin to realize you no longer need to define yourself constantly. You no longer need to explain, justify, or defend yourself. These needs belong to the false identity. Essence does not feel threatened. It has nothing to prove. This inner relief is one of the first signs that something real is happening. The internal matrix feeds on constant self-affirmation. When this falls away, the structure begins to collapse. Thoth points to this collapse as necessary. There is no awakening without the collapse of false identity. And this collapse is not destruction, it is liberation. Physical identity lives in fear of death because it knows it depends on form. Identity beyond the physical does not fear because it did not begin here. This recognition is not belief, it is deep intuition. You have always known this, even without words. That is why death never fully made sense. That is why fear of it always felt strange. Gnosis affirms that the awakened human does not deny death, but does not define themselves by it. Thoth points to continuity of consciousness as a Hermetic principle, not as a religious promise, but as an ontological observation. That which observes does not die with what is observed. You begin to see that the question, who am I, cannot be answered with words. Any verbal answer is already form. True identity exists prior to language. Hermeticism has always warned about the limits of words. Thoth represents knowledge that points, not defines. When you try to define essence, you lose contact with it. When you observe in silence, it reveals itself. This silence is not emptiness, it is presence. The false identity fears silence because it does not exist there. Essence dwells naturally in silence. The matrix remains active while you identify with roles. Professional, child, seeker, wounded, enlightened. All of these roles are transient. Identity beyond the physical is not a role. It observes them all. When you begin to see this, something loosens inside. Life continues, but without excessive weight. Hermeticism has always sought this essential lightness. Thoth points to the order that emerges when the human stops confusing themselves with their functions. You are not what you do, you are what is present while you do. There is a clear difference between understanding this and living this. Understanding is mental, living is ontological. Real awakening happens when this truth ceases to be thought and becomes the point of identification. You begin to live from the observer, not the character. This does not make you indifferent, it makes you lucid. Gnosis calls this awakening from existential sleep. Thoth represents this awakening as return to the axis. The axis was never lost. You merely moved away from it, and now you begin to feel the call back. The resistance that arises now may appear as confusion, fatigue, or even rejection. Observe it without identifying with it. This is the ego trying to reorganize the prison. It prefers a comfortable spirituality to a liberating truth. But Hermetic authority was never comfortable. Thoth did not speak to please. He spoke to reveal. And revelation always hurts what is false. Identity beyond the physical does not negotiate with illusions. It dissolves them. This process is inevitable once remembrance begins. You realize that many pains in your life arose because you tried to live as something you were not. You tried to fit in, tried to meet expectations, tried to define yourself. The soul never wanted this. It merely observed, waiting to be recognized. Hermeticism has always pointed to this mismatch between essence and form as the origin of suffering. Thoth represents the correction of this deviation. When you align with what is not loses strength, not through struggle but through lack of support. Identity beyond the physical does not promise constant happiness. It offers constant truth. And truth liberates because it does not require maintenance. You do not need to sustain what is real. What is real sustains itself. False identity demands continuous effort. Essence requires presence. This exchange changes everything. Gnosis has always valued truth over comfort. Thoth symbolizes this radical choice. And you feel now that you can no longer pretend not to know. Something was touched, something was remembered. From this point on, life begins to test you, not to punish you, but to reveal where you are operating from. Every situation shows whether you react as ego or respond as essence. This feedback is constant. Hermeticism has always worked with this reading of life as an inner mirror. Thoth points to this reading as practical wisdom. Awakening is not isolation in a cave, it is lucidity in the midst of experience. And this lucidity begins with one thing only, knowing who you are not. When you recognize that you are not the body, not the mind, not the story, something remains open. A space. This space is where true identity begins to stabilize, not as a concept, but as living presence. The internal matrix loses strength in this space. The ego tries to fill it with explanations. Do not fall for that. Remain. Hermeticism has always valued conscious remaining. Thoth points to this remaining as the key. Not seeking, not fleeing, just being. In this being, essence reveals itself effortlessly. You begin to realize that the question is no longer, what do I want from life? But what does life want to express through me? This inversion is a clear sign of alignment with the soul's identity. The ego wants to control. Essence allows. This is not passivity. It is deep intelligence. Gnosis calls this cooperation with the principle. Thoth represents this cooperation as cosmic order lived internally. When you align, life flows with less inner resistance, not because everything becomes easy, but because you are no longer divided. Now, observe honestly, if you are not this body, if you are not this mind, if you are not this story, what exactly in you continues to observe all of this right now? And why, even after everything that has been said, does something still resist fully surrendering to the remembrance of your true identity beyond the physical? You feel that something in you remains awake even when everything seems like noise, as if life were happening on the surface, while your essence observes from a deeper point. This perception is not thought, it is recognition. Hermeticism has always been clear. That which perceives does not belong to what is perceived. The body is perceived, the mind is perceived, therefore they are not you. Thoth, as the axis of Hermetic wisdom, points to this primary error that sustains the entire illusion, confusing the medium with the origin. True identity is not born in time, does not move through space, does not depend on matter, it merely uses all of this. And while you forget this, you live reduced. The false identity feeds on urgency. Everything must happen now, everything must be resolved, everything must be proven. The soul does not live at this pace. It observes time as flow, not as threat. When you begin to feel this difference, a deep discomfort arises because the body wants to run and the essence wants to remain. The veil of Maya works by keeping you too busy to remember. The internal matrix thrives when you confuse movement with life. Thoth points to conscious stillness as a sign of alignment, not escape. True identity beyond the physical is not immobile, it is stable, and stability frightens the ego. There comes a moment when you realize that your emotions pass like waves, yet something in you never gets wet. That something has not hardened, has not numbed itself, it simply is not affected in the same way. Gnosis calls this the witness. Hermeticism calls it the conscious principle. Thoth symbolizes this point that observes without getting lost. When you touch it, life shifts perspective. Suffering stops being identity and becomes experience. This does not make you cold, it makes you lucid. And lucidity dissolves many invisible prisons. You were taught to say I to what changes. Now you begin to suspect that the true I never changed. This suspicion does not come from the mind, it comes from a more ancient place. The body ages, ideas change, beliefs fall away, yet something remains identical. That something does not need to be created, only recognized. Thoth never spoke of creating an inner divinity, but of recognizing the divine nature already present. Real awakening is this naked recognition, without adornment, and the ego hates it because it loses the center. Physical identity lives in fear of the end. Identity beyond the physical does not fear because it did not begin here. This difference explains almost all human anguish. Fear of death is fear of form disappearing. Essence does not share this fear. Gnosis has always taught that humans suffer because they identify with what dies. Thoth points to continuity of consciousness as a Hermetic fact, not a religious promise. That which observes the end does not end with what is observed. This understanding shifts the axis of existence. And when the axis shifts, everything reorganizes. You begin to see that much of your pain came from trying to fit into something that was never enough to contain who you are, relationships, roles, expectations. All of this pressured the essence to hide. The false identity was built as armor. The problem is that the armor became a prison. Hermeticism has always spoken of dissolving the false, not strengthening it. Thoth represents this conscious dissolution. When the armor starts to fall away, the ego feels threatened. The soul feels relief. This contrast is the sign that you are in the right place. The mind tries to capture this experience and turn it into a concept, a discourse, a new spiritual identity. Observe this. This is the ego's last refuge. It changes costumes but does not relinquish control. Real awakening does not create a new enlightened persona. It dismantles them all. Thoth did not offer titles. He offered vision. And vision is not displayed. It is lived. Identity beyond the physical does not need to be shown because it cannot be seen. It is what sees. This inversion is simple and devastating at the same time. Spiritual blindness is not total darkness, it is misdirected light. You look outward trying to find what has always been within. Hermeticism has always been a path of returning the gaze. Thoth points to this return as correction of perception. When the gaze turns toward the observer, something realigns. The world does not disappear, but it loses the power to define who you are. The internal matrix depends on that external definition. When it falls, the structure begins to fail. And this failure is liberating. You realize you no longer need to answer everything, explain everything, justify everything. These compulsions belong to the false identity. Essence does not defend itself because it cannot be attacked. When you touch this, a strange calm arises. It is not apathy, it is ontological security. Hermeticism has always valued this inner security as a sign of alignment with the principle. Thoth symbolizes this silent firmness. It is not rigidity, it is clarity. And clarity prevents many conflicts before they even arise. Physical identity lives by comparison. Better, worse, more, less. Identity beyond the physical does not compare. It perceives. This internal shift profoundly changes how you relate to the world. Competition loses meaning. Envy weakens. Fear of falling behind disappears. Not because you became superior, but because you stopped measuring yourself by false criteria. Gnosis calls this liberation from external measure. Thoth points to inner measure as the true reference. And that measure is coherence with essence. You begin to notice that silence becomes more comfortable than noise. Not because you reject the world, but because you find rest in what is stable. The ego fears silence because it finds no nourishment there. The soul recognizes itself in it. Hermeticism has always pointed to conscious silence as a portal, not a practice. Thoth represents this portal as direct access to real identity. No intermediaries, no rituals required. There is presence. And presence is enough for the illusion to begin dissolving. The internal matrix reacts when you start leaving autopilot. It creates distractions, urgencies, dramas. Observe this without involvement. This movement is predictable. Control depends on unconsciousness. When consciousness increases, the system creaks. Thoth did not teach fighting the system, but transcending identification with it. When you do not identify, the system loses power. Identity beyond the physical does not need to destroy the matrix. It simply is not captured by it. You begin to see that your choices change when the point of identification changes. Not out of moral obligation, but alignment. What does not resonate with essence begins to feel uncomfortable. What resonates brings lightness. This feedback is natural. Hermeticism has always worked with this inner listening. Thoth points to this listening as applied intelligence. It is not a mystical voice. It is felt coherence. When you act from false identity, there is where. When you act from essence, there is clarity, even in effort. Identity beyond the physical does not promise absence of pain. It promises absence of confusion. And this difference is decisive. Pain may arise, but it does not become identity. Suffering diminishes because you do not lose yourself in it. Gnosis calls this liberation from unnecessary suffering. Thoth points to this liberation as the fruit of self-knowledge. To know oneself is not to analyze personality, it is to recognize the consciousness that observes it. This recognition changes everything silently. You begin to realize that the question, "Who am I?" finds no answer in memory. All memory is content. True identity exists prior to content. Hermeticism has always warned against this error, seeking the eternal in the transient. Thoth points to presence as the only place where essence reveals itself. Not the present as a concept, but as living experience. When you remain there without fleeing, something stabilizes. And this stability does not depend on external circumstances. The false identity lives in tension because it must be maintained. True identity requires no maintenance. It is self-sustaining. When you feel this, an enormous burden drops from your shoulders. This is not giving up, it is ontological rest. Gnosis has always valued this rest as a sign of return to origin. Thoth symbolizes this return as restored order, not imposed but natural. When internal confusion dissolves, order emerges on its own. You realize you no longer need to cling to beliefs to feel safe. Safety comes from direct perception of what you are. This does not make you dogmatic, it makes you open. Identity beyond the physical does not close itself, does not harden. It observes, learns, experiences without getting lost. Hermeticism was never about fixed belief, it was about lived knowledge. Thoth points to this knowledge as light that does not depend on opinion. When you see, you do not need to convince anyone. Final resistance often appears as attachment to small remaining identities. Observe this honestly. The ego fragments before dissolving. It tries to survive in details. Do not fight it. Observe. Conscious observation is corrosive to illusion. Thoth represents this lucid observation that dissolves without violence. Identity beyond the physical does not need to attack the false. It simply does not sustain it. And what is not sustained falls away. You begin to notice that life responds differently when you change the point of identification. Not because the world changed, but because you changed inner position. Hermeticism has always worked with this reading of reality as a mirror. Thoth points to this mirror as a tool for self-knowledge. Every situation reveals where you still identify with form. Every discomfort points to a layer not yet released. This process is continuous. There is no final event. There is deepening. Identity beyond the physical is not achieved. It is remembered. And remembrance is not a single act, it is a state that stabilizes. The more you recognize the observer, the less power illusion has. This does not happen through effort, but through clarity. Gnosis has always spoken of clarity as liberating. Thoth symbolizes this clarity without ornament. It does not promise external miracles, it promises inner truth. And inner truth reorganizes all experience. Now remain with this without trying to close it into a conclusion. If you are not the body that feels, nor the mind that thinks, what exactly in you is still here, now, observing all of this in silence? If you made it this far, it was not to learn something new, it was because your soul recognized itself behind the body, the mind, and the false identity you carried your entire life. Nothing you lived was by chance. Every sense of not belonging, every emptiness the world could not fill, every intuition that this is not everything, was your essence trying to pierce the veil of illusion. Hermeticism never promised comfort to the ego, it promised truth to the soul. And Thoth always pointed to the same principle. While you confuse yourself with the physical, you will live fragmented. When you remember who observes the physical, nothing can imprison you again. If this message touched something in you, remain on this channel, because each video is a direct call to the identity of the soul, a conscious strike against false identity, and another step toward real awakening. Watch the next contents with presence, not curiosity, because the more you observe, the more illusion loses strength, and the more illusion falls, the more your true identity becomes impossible to forget.